All right, so the first thing we're going to do with Christology is we are going to look at the Gospel of Mark. Now, it may not be apparent as to why we would go first to Mark, but I'll explain why that is in a moment. So everything we're doing at this point is looking at what is in the Gospel according to Mark. And as I said, this is actually where you want to start if you're going to start a course on Christology and you're going to start looking at this question of who is Jesus. This picture here is a depiction, an animal depiction of the Gospel of Mark, the writer of Mark, what have you. All four of the Gospels in the New Testament were eventually associated with particular animals. This is a tradition that comes from the 2nd and 3rd century. It pops out in the works of a church father named Irenaeus. But this is not something that's actually part of the text of Mark, but it is something that does become part of later Christian tradition. So I just wanted you to see this here. This is the symbol or the image that's often associated with the gospel writer Mark or with the text itself. Traditionally speaking, and that means church tradition, as far as Christianity is concerned, the Gospel of Mark was supposedly written by a man named John Mark. Now, all of this has been questioned by modern day historians. So if you go back to the beginnings of modern biblical scholarship in the 17th and 18th centuries down to today, a lot of things that were part of church tradition, such as the Gospel of Mark being written by a man named John Mark, have been called into question. And most churches, whether they're Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Protestant churches, mainline Protestant churches like the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, Presbyterian, some Baptist churches, they too agree with what historians have said about this, that John Mark is probably not the one responsible for writing this particular text. But throughout church history, throughout church tradition, it was thought for a very long time that the writer of Mark was somebody named John Mark, hence the name of the text, the Gospel of Mark. In this tradition, John Mark was thought to be the disciple Peter's personal secretary. Now, Peter, sometimes referred to as Saint Peter, Peter was Jesus's right-hand man. He was the disciple of disciples. He didn't always get things right. In fact, he spent most of his career as a disciple messing things up. But he was Jesus's right-hand man. And the thought, traditionally speaking, is that Peter had a secretary, John Mark, and the idea was that Peter, as an eyewitness to the life and teachings of Jesus, dictated to this guy, John Mark, everything that he saw, everything that he witnessed, and everything that he heard. So if you follow this tradition, it means that you have a pretty reliable text here, because even though John Mark didn't see all of these events, he's recording the events as reported to him by Peter, who was an eyewitness to the life of Jesus. But modern historians question this because the tradition that John Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark seems to first appear in the 2nd century, about 100 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. In fact, it might come even from the 3rd century, so 200 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. In other words, the tradition doesn't seem to be historical. It's late. It doesn't seem to come from the 1st century, when the Gospel of Mark was written, and it doesn't seem to come from the Gospel itself. It seems to be a story that circulated much later that was attached to this text that we call the Gospel of Mark. If we were to look at Mark today purely as historians, and for the sake of making things easy, I'm going to keep calling Mark Mark. The reality is we don't know who wrote this text. Now, if you read through all of the Gospel of Mark, it might have occurred to you that nowhere in this text does the author of this text identify themselves. he, and it probably was a he because most of the individuals who wrote in the ancient world were men. The author of this text, he never says, I am Mark. In fact, the earliest manuscripts of Mark are anonymous. They don't say on the top of them, the gospel according to Mark. They're just anonymous texts. So if we were simply looking at the gospel of Mark as a text, we would have to say we have no idea who wrote it because the author doesn't bother telling us. We do know that the author must have been a Greek-speaking follower of Jesus. I say that because the original text of Mark, all of the New Testament, in fact, was written in Greek. In fact, it was written in a form of Greek called Koine Greek. Koine Greek simply means common Greek or vulgar Greek. It's the Greek of the marketplace. It's the Greek of the streets. If you wanted to communicate the life and times of Jesus to as many people as possible back 2,000 years ago in Israel/Palestine or throughout the Roman Empire, well, then you'd write the story in Greek because that's what most people spoke. So the author of this text originally wrote in Greek. So what we know is that this was probably a Greek-speaking Christian, a Greek-speaking follower of Jesus. That means the author is probably somewhat educated because if you're able to write in Greek, if you're able to read, that means you're part of the educated class. Roughly speaking, on a good day, about 10% of people in the Greco-Roman world, particularly in the Roman Empire, were literate. So if you're able to write Greek and read Greek, it might even be your second language, but it means you're educated. So if we just look at the text, this means that we have a text written by an unknown author who's a Greek-speaking Christian who obviously has some type of education in reading and writing. Now, Jesus himself died around the year 30 or the year 33. But modern historians, for all kinds of reasons we're not going to go into, think that the Gospel of Mark was likely written about 35 to 40 years after the death of Jesus, which puts it at about the year 65 or the year 70, somewhere between the year 65 and the year 70. If you're off by 5 years, even sometimes 10 years in the ancient world, that is not that big of a deal. Now, that's kind of an amazing thing if you think about it, because it means that 3 decades, 3.5 decades, maybe even 4 decades passed from the death of Jesus, let's say in the year 30, to make things simple, to the writing of Mark, to the writing of the first gospel. It would be nice if we actually knew what happened in those 30, 35 years, 40 years. It would be nice if we knew why someone decided to write this text 30 to 40 years after the death of Jesus. It would be nice to know how the life and story and teachings of Jesus were passed on in this 30 to 40 year period. Now, if you've been thinking about this, it does present us with some problems because it means that decades have passed since the time of Jesus and then the writing of stories about Jesus. In fact, scholars are convinced that the earliest of all the New Testament writings, or not all the New Testament writings, I should say, but the earliest of the Gospels is actually Mark. Even though in the New Testament the order is Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Matthew does not come first. Mark comes first. And if Mark is written first, well, one of the difficult things here is, did Mark get the stories right? Since Mark is writing 30, 35, 40 years after the death of Jesus. Did stories about Jesus change? Were they passed on faithfully or were they not? I mean, are we talking about something here like an ancient form of the telephone game where something was said back in the year 31 or 32, and then in the year 65, the whole story of what was said 30 years before has completely changed. It's morphed into something different, something else. The reality is we just don't know. But it is important to keep in mind that the first stories about Jesus are written long after his death. I mean, this would be like the first stories of the 1980s, of the Reagan administration, being written down for the first time today. Or it'd be like the first histories of Vietnam being written down today. So, all we really know as historians about Mark is that we have no idea who wrote it. The author never tells us. Church tradition has often said John Mark, but even that is now questioned in various church traditions. It was written in Greek. It was written by a Greek-speaking follower of Jesus, someone who was obviously educated, probably written 35 to 40 years after the death of Jesus, and it's likely the earliest of our Gospels. And again, if we had more time, if this was an actual introduction to the Gospel course, we would talk about the reasons for this. So you can read about some of this in your textbooks, but there are very good historical reasons for why historians want to date Mark several years after Jesus and also want to name it and claim it as the earliest of our canonical Gospels. Well, all of that aside, and more important for our purposes in Christology, is what's in Mark? What is the content of Mark? And what does Mark have to say about Jesus? And all throughout this course, what we're going to see, whether it's Mark, whether it's Matthew, whether it's John, whether it's Paul writing letters, every single writer of the New Testament tends to have a slightly different take on Jesus. Like I said, this is like looking at the reverse angle camera image of a play in football. From one angle, it doesn't look like a touchdown. From another angle, it does look like a touchdown. If you remember me talking about this in the welcome and introduction to the syllabus lecture. Well, if we're just looking at Mark for a moment as a text, putting aside who wrote it, when was it written, and all of that, Mark is a pretty fascinating text. In fact, one of the great things that Mark does for us is Mark, whoever it was, he tells us right in the very first sentence of his gospel, this is what my story is about. So right away in Mark chapter 1, verse 1, Mark writes this: the beginning of the good news. That word good news is the word gospel. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, this is, if you will, Mark's thesis statement. I mean, right away he tells you, here's what I want you to get. Jesus is the Christ, he's the Messiah, and he's the Son of God. Everything else I'm going to write is about that. Now, this is a text that is nothing like modern biography. It looks a lot like ancient biographies, ancient lives of famous individuals, whether it's various emperors of Rome or leaders in Greek or certain lives of famous philosophers. But it doesn't look anything like a modern day biography. There's no indication in this text that the author of the Gospel of Mark is setting out to write a historically accurate biography. I mean, this is not how you would start a historically accurate biography. You wouldn't start it out with the line, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. It's not how you would do it at all. But this is right away where Mark's story starts. This is what I want you to get as a writer. This Jesus I'm going to tell you about, he's the Messiah and he's the Son of God. And everything else in this text is going to be about that point. Now, we've already talked about this a bit, but this is Christology. Right away, here in the earliest gospel, in the very first chapter, in the very first sentence. Right away, Mark tells us Jesus is the Christ. And as I told you in another lecture, Christ is a title. Christ comes from the Greek word Christos. You can see it here on the screen. Christos, which simply means the anointed one. It means that Jesus is the Messiah. Christos is another word for the term Messiah. So right away, Mark is simply saying, this Jesus character, he's the Messiah. He's the anointed one. But what you find out throughout Mark is there's a question about what does this even mean that he's the Christ, that he's the Messiah. In fact, a number of individuals throughout Mark are going to ask a basic question. Can Jesus even be the Messiah? Is that possible for him to be the Messiah? And part of why, just to preview what's going to happen here in Mark, part of why people are asking that question, even followers of Jesus, is because the Jesus of Mark's gospel seems to think, as does Mark, that the Christ, the Messiah, is supposed to die. But if you're a good Jew, like Jesus' followers, or any Jew in the first century, the Messiah of the Jewish people, the anointed one, is not supposed to die. You're supposed to triumph. The big thing that you're supposed to do as the anointed one, as the Messiah, as the Christ, is you are supposed to save your people. And what that means is if you're a Jew in the first century, in the time of Jesus, you are supposed to free your people from the oppressive tyranny of the Roman Empire. You're not supposed to die at the hands of the Roman Empire. You're supposed to triumph over them. In fact, there is no tradition that historians have been able to find, no tradition in Judaism of a dying Messiah. Messiahs don't die. If they die, then they're not true messiahs. But all throughout this text, Mark is almost painfully at times trying to tell people that's precisely why Jesus is the Messiah. He's the Messiah because he suffers, because he dies. In other words, it's like Mark is saying, it's all backwards from what we thought. The Messiah doesn't triumph. The Messiah triumphs by dying. And what Mark is trying to do in this gospel is essentially prove that point. Well, you might not think he's the Messiah because he dies, but that's precisely why he's the Messiah, because he dies. And it's not an easy feat because, again, any Jew, even the followers of Jesus, are sitting around in the first century going, that is not how this is supposed to work. Well, the Gospel of Mark, unlike the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John, moves very, very fast. So we're told Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And then we're told that all of this has been foretold in the Hebrew Bible, what Christians sometimes call the Old Testament. It's all been told by the prophet Isaiah, that all of this has been laid out by God for a very, very long time. And in order to start proving to his readers and his hearers that this Jesus guy might really be the Messiah, Mark starts telling stories about Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. Right after Jesus is baptized, we're still in the very first chapter of Mark. A lot is happening here. Mark tells a brief story about Jesus going into the wilderness and being tempted by Satan. He then starts to talk about how Jesus calls his first disciples, how he heals people, how he exorcises demons from people. And again, this is all just in chapter 1 and chapter 2. All of these stories are meant to show people that, look, Jesus is a great man doing great, unbelievable deeds. And yet, as you're reading this, you sort of start to get this odd feeling that even though he's doing all of this stuff, a lot of people don't get who he is and they don't get what he's doing. In fact, a question a lot of modern readers of Mark have is, why doesn't anyone get it? Well, just to show you how some of this works and some of the absurdity of this, in Mark chapter 3, I'll start at verse 20. There's this very interesting story about the family of Jesus, his own family members, not understanding who he is and rejecting him. Mark writes, "Then he went home, and the crowd came together again, so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, he has gone out of his mind." His family is trying to hold him back. In fact, a little later on, as I'll show you, they're kind of upset at what he's doing. In fact, if you look several verses later in chapter 3, verse 31, Mark writes, "Then his mothers and his brothers came. They were standing outside. They sent to him and they called him. A crowd was sitting around him and they said to him, 'Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you.' And Jesus replied, 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' And looking at those who sat around him, he said, 'You, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother.'" We don't see this in any of the other Gospels, but in Mark, there's a lot of tension between Jesus' family and Jesus himself. In this same chapter, the Jewish leaders reject Jesus. They see all these signs and all these wonders and reject him. In chapter 3, verse 22, Mark writes, "And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, 'He has Beelzebul.'" In other words, he's possessed by this demon, Beelzebul. "And by the ruler of the demons, he casts out demons." I mean, so one of the objections to Jesus being the Messiah in this text is that, well, he's actually possessed. In chapter 6, he's rejected by people in his hometown. The people he grew up with reject him. Starting right at the beginning of chapter 6. He left that place and came to his hometown. His disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor except in their hometown, and among their own kin, and in their own house." And he could do no deed of power there except that he laid hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed by their unbelief. And these types of stories continue on and on and on in Mark. Jesus just seems to be rejected wherever he goes, even though he's healing people and casting out demons and teaching people. No one seems to get it. In fact, later on in chapter 6, his own disciples aren't sure who he is. His own followers. Starting in verse 51 of chapter 6. Then he got into the boat with his disciples, and the wind ceased. And they were astounded, for they didn't understand anything about the miracle of the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. And this is kind of a motif that goes on and on and on and on throughout Mark. Mark's told us right from the beginning, this is a story about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. And nobody gets it. His family doesn't get it. The religious leaders don't get it. The political leaders don't get it. His own followers don't get it. People who've known him for years in his hometown don't get it. I mean, it's almost a very tragic story. One of the things that scholars have often wondered about Mark is, why is Jesus' identity such a secret? In fact, there are a number of places throughout Mark's gospel, and you might have caught this, where Jesus does in fact tell people, do not tell anyone who I am. Now they go and do it anyway, but he tells them not to do it. And this is one of these peculiar features of the narrative of Mark. Despite the fact that a lot of people don't know who he is, there are a few individuals, a few characters throughout the narrative who know exactly who he is. If you look back in the first chapter of Mark, verse 11, a voice came from heaven. This is when Jesus is being baptized. And the voice from heaven, presumably God's voice or something like that, says, "You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." So Mark tells us, well, God knows who he is. Perhaps one of the weirdest group of characters that know who Jesus is in this narrative are the demons that he exorcises from people. When Jesus goes around and he casts demons out of people, the demons often respond to Jesus by telling Jesus exactly who he is. If you look at Mark chapter 3, starting at verse 11. Whenever the unclean spirits saw Jesus, they fell down before him and shouted, "You are the Son of God." And Jesus sternly ordered them not to make it known to anyone else. So God knows, these demons that Jesus exorcises from people know. The author, Mark, whoever that was, knows, and you as the reader know, but that's kind of it throughout the entire gospel. Now there's one more character who will figure it out, who will actually have the punchline of the gospel, and perhaps one of the most ironic scenes of the Gospel of Mark. But as this gospel goes along, his family doesn't seem to get it. His followers don't get it. His friends and people from his hometown, his own neighbors don't get it. The Jewish leaders don't get it. But you get it, the writer gets it, the demons get it, and God gets it. A very strange, peculiar narrative. But then something happens in the middle of the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark can pretty much be divided fairly evenly between Mark chapter 1 and half of Mark chapter 8 and the last half of Mark chapter 8 all the way to the end of the Gospel. But Mark chapter 8 is pivotal to everything going on in the Gospel of Mark. This story appears in Mark chapter 8, starting at verse 22. And this story is emblematic, even symbolic, of what has been going on in Mark and what's going to start happening in the rest of the gospel. Mark writes, "They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to Jesus and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, 'Can you see anything?' And the man looked up and said, 'I can see people, but they look like trees walking.' Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." Now, this is a weird story for all kinds of reasons, but scholars have often pointed out the strangest thing with the story is that Jesus has to heal the guy twice before he can see everything, which is kind of embarrassing when you think about it, because you would assume that the Son of God, the Messiah, only has to heal somebody once, and then poof, they're okay. But in this story, Jesus touches the blind man once, and he says, "What do you see?" And he can sort of see, but not clearly. Then he touches him again, and he can see everything. This is the gradual healing of a blind man. And this story it functions symbolically in the Gospel of Mark, because everybody up to this point, except for the four I've mentioned, is blind when it comes to who Jesus is, the question of who Jesus is. The disciples don't get it, his family doesn't get it, etc. But after this blind man is healed, people slowly start getting it. It's as if they're slowly losing their blindness. They're gradually starting to get it. They're gradually starting to see. In fact, Jesus' right-hand man, the disciple Peter, will finally blurt out who Jesus is, and Jesus will be just so utterly proud of him for finally getting it. In this same chapter, chapter 8, there's this confession from Peter, this declaration from Peter. Starting in verse 27, Mark writes this: Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Now, let me stop there for a second. That is Christology right there. That is what created this entire field of Christology, that question. Who do people say that I am? That's the question of Christology. And what Jesus is doing here, it's a strange story, because he's simply asking his disciples, what's the gossip about me? What's the scuttlebutt around the region about me? What are people saying about me? You would think Jesus wouldn't care, but he seems to care about this. And they answered him. John the Baptist. Others say Elijah, still others one of the prophets. And then Jesus turns to his followers and says, "Great, that's nice. Who do you think I am? Who do you say that I am?" Again, the question of Christology. Who am I? And Peter answers. He blurts out, "You are the Messiah." And again, very strange thing that often happens in Mark. Jesus tells his followers, "Don't tell anyone about me." Now, Peter got it right. The answer to the question, who do you say I am, is you're the Messiah. One of the great things about the Gospel of Mark is that it tells us, I guess this is kind of depressing, but it tells us it's not enough to come up with the right answer. You have to know what that answer actually means. And even though Peter gets it right, you are the Messiah, he has no idea what he just said. He has no idea what this means. If we read on, Jesus starts to explain to Peter and his other followers what it means to be the Messiah and what it means to be the Son of God. And they don't like what he's saying. Then he began to teach them, this is verse 31 of chapter 8, that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes. That's the religious leaders of Judaism. That he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Jesus said all of this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Now, to be fair to Peter, Peter's a Jew from the first century who's never heard of a Messiah that's supposed to die. This is shocking news to him. In a sense, Peter's taking Jesus aside to correct him, to say, this is not how it's supposed to work. And Jesus is furious at this. In fact, Mark writes, but turning and looking at his disciples, he rebukes Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. And then he goes on to explain again, the Messiah, the Son of God, must suffer and die. But to be fair to his followers, this is a completely new concept to them. So Peter gets the answer right, but he has no idea what it means. He certainly doesn't understand Jesus' definition of the Messiah, that the Messiah is someone who must suffer and die at the hands of the political leaders and the religious leaders. And that's how you triumph. Well, throughout Mark's gospel, what Mark is trying to say to his readers and his hearers is, yeah, Jesus actually is the Messiah. Even though people don't get it, even though Peter gets it but doesn't know what it means, Jesus is the Messiah precisely because he has to suffer and die. Again, Mark is telling everyone, we've had it wrong. The Messiah doesn't triumph by kicking out our oppressors, in this case, the Romans. The Messiah triumphs by dying at the hands of the religious leaders and the political leaders. And so from here on out, Jesus is going to spend a lot of time predicting his own death. We already saw an instance of this in chapter 8, verse 31. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He does the same thing in chapter 9, verse 31. For he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands. They will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again from the dead. But they did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. In chapter 10, the same thing happens. Jesus predicts his death, and they still don't get it. Well, it's been said by a number of scholars, and I think this is true, that Mark is a passion narrative with a very, very long introduction. Now, a passion narrative is a story about the suffering and death of an individual. Passion simply means to suffer. If anyone has ever been passionately, madly in love, they know that that's as euphoric as it is painful. So passion is suffering. 6 of Mark's 16 chapters are about Jesus' last days. A lot of time moves very quickly in the first 10 chapters of Mark, but you get to the last 6 chapters, time slows down. And the entire narrative of Mark focuses on details of Jesus' last day. It looks like in Mark, the entire ministry of Jesus takes place over a year. Mark kind of zips through it, gives you the highlights of it, and then slows everything down to the last week or so of Jesus' life. When Mark talks about the last days of Jesus, he tells us about Jesus going up to the city of Jerusalem. He goes up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover meal with his disciples and to celebrate Passover like any good Jew would do. Mark tells us that Jesus spends a week preaching in the temple. And he says a number of things while he's preaching in the temple that kind of get him in trouble. We'll come back to that in a moment. But when Jesus is in the temple and he starts predicting the destruction of the temple of God, it really upset some priests, individuals that work in the temple. He has a last meal, a Passover meal with his disciples. He's betrayed by Judas, one of his followers. He's arrested. He's denied 3 times by his right-hand man, Peter. And finally, he's captured by the Jewish leaders, the Jewish religious leaders, and the Roman authority figures, and he's put on trial. The result of it is that he's sentenced to death by crucifixion. So it's a pretty event-filled last few days of Jesus' life. But Mark slows everything down when we get to the last chapters of Mark to focus on the death of Jesus, because for Mark, everything about Jesus being the Son of God, everything about Jesus being the Messiah, is that he must suffer, he must die. People often ask this very basic question: why was Jesus killed? Mark has an answer to this. It might not be a satisfying answer to you, but most scholars think Jesus is killed because of something he does, something he says, which in Mark's gospel occurs in chapter 13. Chapter 13 of Mark's gospel is called the Little Apocalypse, because this is a chapter in which Jesus talks about the end of time, how it's all going to pan out. You should read it in full if you haven't already. If you've already read through the Gospel of Mark, read it again, because there are some fascinating things going on in this text. But Jesus starts out Mark 13 by talking about the destruction of the temple of God. Mark writes, "As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, 'Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings.' Then Jesus asked him, 'Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down.'" Now, this is almost a religious act, or an act, I should say, of religious treason. It's tantamount to a prophet walking into a great religious structure like the Vatican and saying, "Do you see this building? Very soon it will be nothing. It will be destroyed." I mean, today, if we overheard that at the Vatican or an equivalent place, we might think, is this person planning a terrorist attack on the Vatican, on the Basilica of St. Peter? And that's kind of how historians think the Jewish religious leaders heard Jesus, that he was saying he personally was going to destroy this place. Now, that's not what he's saying at all, but that might have been what they heard. The story goes on and says, "When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, 'Tell us, when will this be?'" They want to know, when is the temple going to be destroyed? "And what will be the sign that these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus said to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. But this is just the beginning of the birth pangs." So Jesus tells his disciples, I'm not the one who's going to destroy it. Somebody else is. But the way this was probably heard by people is that it was Jesus who was going to do this. And this might really be why he was arrested and why he was put on trial, as people thought he was actually threatening the religious establishment in Jerusalem. One thing that most historians today agree on is that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet, that the historical Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. And you see this all throughout Mark chapter 13. Now, when I talk about apocalypse or apocalyptic, what I'm talking about is the end of all things. Prophets who are apocalyptic are prophets of gloom and doom. They tell you the world is going to end, and here's how it's all going to happen. And you see this in the Gospel of Mark. In fact, in chapter 13, starting at verse 24, Mark writes about Jesus talking about the end of all things. But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. This is apocalyptic language. Things are going to change. The world as you know it will no longer exist. The stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out his angels and gather his chosen from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. And in fact, Jesus later on in verse 30 tells his followers, some of you will see all of this happen, which is very problematic because it didn't happen in Jesus' lifetime, and it didn't happen in the lifetime of many of his followers, and it still hasn't happened. Christians are still waiting on Jesus to come as the Son of Man. But this is Jesus, the apocalyptic prophet, saying, I am telling you it's all going to end, and end very soon. Like, don't make plans for the weekend soon. And this is probably what gets Jesus in trouble. He's brought before the religious leaders of Israel, then he's brought before the governmental officials representing the Roman Empire in Jerusalem. They sentence Jesus to crucifixion. Crucifixion is not a Jewish form of punishment. It is a Roman form of punishment. Capital punishment for the Jews is death by stoning. Capital punishment for Romans is death by crucifixion. It's disgusting. It's absolutely nasty. As you can see in this picture, this is one small example of the bones of a crucified individual from around the time of Jesus, contemporary with the time of Jesus. Nails would be put through your ankle bones, your legs would be put together in various positions, and then nails would be put through your arms, not your hand, but on the fleshy part of your arm. And essentially what would happen when you were crucified is you would suffocate because you can't hold yourself up forever. And eventually when you collapse, your lungs collapse, your throat, etc., and you can't breathe. This is an archaeologist's rendering of what crucifixion was like at the time of Jesus. It's also important for you to note that unlike a lot of the depictions in movies and things that you see of Jesus and anyone who was crucified wouldn't have been 20 feet off the ground or 10 feet off the ground. They were at eye level. The Romans wanted you to look at the people they were humiliating and crucifying, so they would have been right at eye level. Well, Jesus dies. He's handed over to the Jewish leaders, then to the Roman leaders, and he's crucified. And typical of the whole theme and tragedy of Mark, Jesus' last words in the Gospel of Mark are very, very tragic. In chapter 15, starting at verse 33, Mark writes, "When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, 'Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani,' which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The theme of Mark is to be the Messiah. It's all about suffering and dying, to such an extent that the narrative of Mark says that even Jesus felt like his own Father, God, had abandoned him at the end. So, who do you say that I am? Well, the answer is the Messiah, the Son of God. What that means is not triumph. It means suffering and it means death. The Christology of Mark is a Christology of suffering and dying. And ironically, that's how you triumph. The strangest thing about Mark is that there is one other character in this whole narrative who figures it out, who actually gets what I like to call the punchline of the gospel. So Jesus cries out, "Why have you forsaken me, God?" And then in verse 37, Mark writes, Jesus gave a loud cry and he breathed his last. He dies. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, when a Roman centurion who stood facing him, probably somebody who crucified him, saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this was God's Son." Amazingly, you have this story, the end of Jesus' life. He's been deserted by Peter. Judas has betrayed him. He feels like God has forsaken him. The guy that killed him, one of the individuals who killed him or who was part of the crucifixion, the Roman centurion, actually figures it out. This is God's Son. And this is such a tragic story. I mean, it should be right up there with the best of Greek tragedy. And then you get an ending. In fact, you get two endings to the Gospel of Mark. 3 days after Jesus was killed, he's buried. Women, not his disciples, not his male disciples, but women followers, female disciples, female followers of Jesus, come first to his tomb. And in a very odd story, they find out that the tomb is empty. They bump into a young man. We assume it's a messenger or an angel of some sort. It's not clear. They realize that Jesus isn't there, that the tomb is empty, and the gospel actually ends with the words, "So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." And that's how Mark originally ended. It's really strange. These women show up 3 days after his death. They find the tomb empty. And that's it. They're terrified. Mark doesn't tell us what this means. He doesn't elaborate on the resurrection of Jesus. He just tells you the tomb was empty and everybody was scared to death. Now, the Gospel of Matthew will add much more details. So will Luke, so will John. But Mark just kind of ends on that note of fear. Very odd and very strange, and something to think about. Now, if you have a good Bible, like the NRSV or a study Bible or something like that, you might notice that there is a shorter ending to Mark, and then there is a longer ending to Mark. As far as we know, this longer ending to Mark was added centuries later. What probably happened is various scribes in the church didn't like Mark ending on this note of the tomb was empty and everybody was afraid, and so a bunch of stuff was added to try and make it much more clear that Jesus had risen again, that he came back to life. But that's not the original ending of Mark. The longer ending comes centuries later. The original ending of Mark is just simply that everyone was afraid, and then you get these few sentences, and all that had been commanded them they told briefly to those around Peter, and afterward Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. So you either have this much longer ending, or you have something very short that just says he died, some women showed up at the tomb, and he wasn't there. Now, for your purposes, in terms of Christology, again, Mark's take on this, and again, this is the earliest gospel, is that Jesus really is the Messiah. But nobody seems to get that, except you, the writer of Mark, God, these demons that Jesus casts out, and eventually the Roman centurion. Everybody seems to abandon Jesus. In fact, Jesus feels like God has abandoned him in this text. But what Mark is trying to say is it's the suffering of Jesus. It's the death of Jesus that makes him the Messiah. So when that question of Christology is asked, who do you say that I am? Peter gets the answer right. You're the Messiah. You're the Son of God. But he has no idea what that means. He thinks it should mean triumph, but for the writer of Mark, triumph comes through death and through suffering.